Today I'm talking to Julia Bueno. She's a psychotherapist and counsellor and has been for some 20 years or so, but she started out her career as a lawyer. She's published 2 books, the first being The Brink of Being, and that discusses the experience of miscarriage. It was the British Medical Association's most popular medicine book of 2021. Her latest book, which I'll be talking to her about today, is called Everyone's a Critic. And it deals with issues relating to everyone's inner critic. And it deals with those through a number of different characters which occupy each chapter of the book. She's been published in The Times, The Sunday Times, The New York Times, and she reviews books for The Times Literary Supplement. Hello, Julia. Thank you for taking the time to talk to me this morning.
Thank you for having me, Rupert. Good to meet.
Your background, you started out in law. How did that come about?
Well, kind of parenthetically, because it was a very, very brief career in law, but having read law at university and topped it up with a master's degree, I wandered into practice as a solicitor, but very briefly. It was only a couple of years before I abandoned ship, before I think the ship abandoned me, really. I found pretty early on that I was bending myself out of shape trying to be a lawyer.
Not for you?
Not for me. But what I did learn in my very brief experience of sitting with clients trying to rearrange their tax affairs is that I was far more interested in their stories and their family dynamics and sort of peeping under the hood. I was less interested in their bank accounts. So that sort of sowed a seed.
So it was a sort of a segue almost into what you're doing now.
Kind of. I mean, various other things happened along the way that kind of constellated, and actually the biggest kick for me to requalify was just a personal tragedy. And quite often you'll find that therapists are led to therapy through sort of personal experiences, but that was a sort of clincher. But certainly I, not wanting to be a lawyer, repivoted me in another direction.
And so back to college it was it, for you?
Yeah, back to college while working, I was doing some editorial writing work. That's where my writing began after leaving law, and then 5-year requalification along the way. So
a lot of years at college to requalify, and you're now practicing as a psychotherapist.
That's right, yeah.
So how does your day-to-day work pan out?
It involves a lot of clinical work. So my day starts very early. I get people coming to see me before they go to work. So my day starts with them. And I'm fortunate enough to have a very busy practice. So I work one-to-one pretty much every day, all day, and get to talk to a lot of people about a lot of things. But as you could imagine from my 2 books, I have a specialist interest in supporting people through the experiences of pregnancy loss and infertility and sort of family bereavement, and also sort of supporting people build their relationships with themselves, which involves often unpacking an inner critic, which is how I came to write the book.
Yeah, so that brings us nicely on to your new book, which I think was published last year.
Yeah.
Everyone's a Critic. So explain a little bit about what the title means and how you chose to write about it.
Yeah, I mean, after my first book, which you mentioned, I wrote about that because it was something I knew a lot about, and after that was published, I was quite keen to write another book and landed upon the next thing that I knew a lot about, both kind of personally and professionally. And everyone's a critic, because I have found in my clinical experience that the vast majority of people I talk to, and they might present to me with anxiety or depression or relationship problems, or eating disorders, or I'm fairly eclectic in my practice, but the vast majority of them, underneath all their presenting problems, wrestle with low self-worth, a part of them that doesn't feel good enough. And, you know, the range is large. Sometimes it might be a kind of subtle sense of just unease in themselves and not quite liking themselves, to, at the other extent, some pretty vicious and nasty self-talk and damaging behaviours. But that seems to be the kind of golden thread of so many people, of so much of my practice and so many stories that I hear. So I just sort of wanted to pull that theme out.
So it's something that you've really, a knowledge of which you've developed through practice rather than something that you necessarily studied.
Well, no, I think it takes one to know one as well. I mean, I think you'll find that psychotherapists tend to practice in and write about areas that really resonate with their own personal experience. I don't know whether that happens in the law, but it's certainly the case, I think, with psychotherapists. So I guess I have a sort of specialist interest in, as I did with pregnancy loss, having gone through pregnancy loss myself. But I was drawn to really thinking about self-criticism because it had been a bit of a cross that I had to bear for a very long time.
But how do you separate out your own experience from obviously trying to assist the person that's come to see you to receive your help?
That's a good question, and that's something that any conscious and good therapist is sort of working on at all times. We have to do our best to bracket our own kind of personal experience so that we don't project it onto our clients or kind of get it muddled. And all we can do with that is to be kind of conscious, have our own therapy, talk about it in supervision. And, you know, if it does come into the room and gets muddled up, then you own it and talk about it. But I would say this, wouldn't I? I think over the years it gets easier to do that. And also I would say that my own self-critic has been more or less tamed. I mean,
put her in a box, or
well, not quite put in a box, because
she should get out of it.
I think the metaphor is more less sort of fighty. I think the idea with your self-critic is you learn to kind of understand what he or she is trying to do with respect, and you just sort of politely agree to disagree, and you don't get into war or conflict with it, because it will only fight back even
that's
more.
Something I'm going to ask you about in a bit, if that's all right.
Yeah.
You said that inner criticism is almost a theme or a thread in pretty much all of the people that come to see.
Yeah, I would say so. It's pretty the technical is pretty trans-diagnostic. You know, you'll find it lurking beneath so many presentations of distress, and also there's it can become quite complicated and layered, because quite often the top layer of self-criticism I deal with people when they come to see me is the first one, which is around criticising their self-critic, that people feel even kind of badly about coming to therapy in the first place. They don't quite kind of deserve it. And you know, they've got this sort of low self-worth thing that they really should get over. So yeah, it can become quite kind of entrenched thing. But as I say,
with inadequacy almost, that they have to seek help.
Quite.
Right. Your book is structured by way of a number of different characters. I imagine they're of course not entirely real people, but
no,
they must be a mixture of fact and fiction. Is that correct?
Yeah, I mean, of course you're right. I mean, you know about confidentiality, and I'd be in all sorts of trouble if I breached that. But I think it's safe to say they are, they're composites. It's very difficult to describe the kind of process of creating them, but I'm definitely aware of some sort of people that linger in my mind. But just putting a story on top of the themes, really, it's just a way of storytelling.
Yeah, and one of them is a lawyer. So one of the chapters is based on a lady called Amanda.
Yeah,
who's a solicitor, relatively junior practitioner, who's struggling at work. Could you just talk about some of the themes in relation to that character and that chapter?
Yeah, I mean, each character really I created as a vehicle to unpack some what I understand to be, or I experience to be, very usual and influences on people who to internalize a self-criticism, to internalize a criticism. So I wanted to look at bullying. I wanted to look at parents who do their best but perhaps get it wrong, as we all do. And I wanted to look at sort of orthodox religion and homophobia and sexism and racism. So in order to do that, I constructed stories that could bring those to light. And Amanda is a woman, and she's black, and she works in a very competitive field. So it was quite I saw it as a neat way of sort of bringing quite a few themes to light, including her internalized racism and misogyny.
Yeah, and she, her character is she's in a team in a law firm, and she feels completely overlooked, which I think resonates with her upbringing. Is that something that you see a lot?
Well, yes, I see a hell of a lot. In fact, I'm just thinking of a conversation I had with someone yesterday. I talked to a lot of women who still struggle enormously in the professional field with having to balance, for what comes up a lot, wanting to start a family, and whether, when they get pregnant and getting sidelined and overlooked, and the big debate. So, conversation I had with someone yesterday, somebody who's 10 weeks pregnant. Do I reveal this small firm? Do I reveal it to be helpful in the planning and risk management of my company, or do I reveal that I'm going to be out of the game and then I'm not going to get the promotion that I'm up for? Probably yes. This happens all the time. And of course, in Amanda's particular case, I don't really need to kind of flesh out the reality of the lived experience of being a black person in Britain today, and her daily experience of racism. And we, in the chapter, we talk about what's called, the microaggressions she receives all the time, both in the firm and outside of the world, as well as the kind of more obvious, egregious macroaggressions. But
particularly perhaps in a profession which, like law, which is perhaps lags behind.
Absolutely,
lags behind other areas.
Yes, and I think there was one little vignette in the chapter I wrote about, because it's during the pandemic, so she's working on screen and they're having all these Zoom meetings, and of course all these little tiny faces pop up, and she doesn't see her own face reflected back. It's all white skins and a lot of men, and in one case I think she has a particularly annoying male colleague who just sort of talks over her all the time.
Yeah.
I mean, I know this was a million years ago, but when I was a trainee solicitor, it was 30 years ago, when I remember being in a seat, we get revolved around each seat, and I was with a fellow male trainee, and it was sort of the first week of our internship. Then I was the one asked to go and pick up the dry cleaning. And I talked about this actually at a gathering of women where there were lawyers present not so long ago. And I said, well, that was 30 years ago. And the comment was, well, it's not that moved on that much. I mean, in some ways it has, but there are still great pockets of areas of improvement.
And I don't know whether that links into certainly something that you discuss in the chapter with Amanda of what's called imposter syndrome.
Yeah.
Can you just explain what that is and how, particularly in the field of law? I think a lot of us suffer from it, actually. I know. It is really common. I really should know the stats by now, because there has been lots of research, but it is a very familiar syndrome amongst a lot of people. I talk to in my consulting room, but that sense of just getting a tap on your shoulder and being told, we've got your number, we know you're a fraud, really not believing that you are worthy of the role that you're in and that you're good enough. And I think that comes, in my experience, when I unpack it with people, quite often it's people who have developed a sense of self-worth and being good enough by external
affirmations, or what's called in the trade, external loci of evaluation. In other words, you have grown up being somehow receiving the message that you are okay if you've got your A star or your gold medal, or you're on the football first team, or you've got your grade 8. And I can't keep up with it now. They're not A stars anymore. They're 9s, aren't they? But the point being that if you've had a whole development where you're receiving the message, and of course, what's different from our day is that the kids these days have this whole other meta layer of social media and online existence, which is sending so many other powerful messages about how you have to look like, and what exercises you should be doing, and what makeup you should be wearing, and so all of that compounds to create a very fragile existence of self-worth. If it's constantly being pegged on something outside of you, there isn't enough of a core. If all goes well, wouldn't it be great if we grew up and arrived at adulthood, obviously not wanting to be narcissistic or arrogant or too big for our boots, but about the right size, feeling I'm okay, whatever I do, whatever happens to me, but the core sense of I'm okay in the world.
Well, I suppose what you're describing is a need or a want for external validation. Is that right or not?
Well, I guess I think there is definitely a human need to feel a core sense in all of us to feel good enough, to feel okay, to feel secure, to feel that we're okay in the world. Yeah. And as I say, if that hasn't logged inside of us through whatever reason, just in being, for who we are, whether we get a A or a D, or we don't even play an instrument or whatever, then that's going to serve us well. But if somehow through whatever reasons, and my books kind of unpacks lots of causes for attrition of this, but if we end up thinking we're only worthy because we need to strive and achieve and do well, and there are lots of professions, including law, which is a very competitive, high-achieving one, full of very competitive, high-achieving people who've had to strive incredibly hard to get their place in the law firm or their pupillage or whatever it is. So it's a fairly self-selecting population. You're in a kind of hotbed of people striving and who have kind of fused, I'm good enough because, I've achieved this.
Yeah. I mean, let me just ask you sort of more specifically.
Yeah.
How an inner critic can function, particularly with a lawyer. And forgive me if I speak about my own experience to a degree. I know from my own experience that I will go over a piece of work time and time again, adjusting it, really petrified that I've missed something or got something wrong. And it's that can only be a product of an inner critic. And I think, I suppose what I'm saying is that to a degree, can the inner critic be beneficial or helpful, particularly to a lawyer?
Well, yes. I think every human being should have a healthy dollop of inner criticism, and therein lies the difference. I think it makes sense, does it not, for us to have some sense of internal check and self-correction, and to learn to be humble enough to know that we need to keep growing and developing and learning. But it's just what I'm getting at in the book is about how we go about it and what the internal climate is. To hear that you're petrified, I think you know better than I, you're inside of you, but yes, that sounds to me like a pretty harsh environment going on in there, that there's that self-critic telling you, if you get this wrong, all hell will be this catastrophic. I'm restraining from swearing here, but it's just instinctive to do that. But
I don't think I'm alone in that.
It's really common. This is why I'm so busy. I'm a very busy practitioner. But my point being is, I happen to know you've got kids, but I imagine when you help them with their homework, you didn't loom over them going, you complete bloody idiot, if you get this maths wrong, God, you're going to be a disaster. You're not going to get your maths over, and you're going to be a complete failure. No, I'm guessing. Okay, maybe you had the odd day, but I'm guessing generally you were patient. Come on, let's try it again. You're doing really well here. Now we sort of abandon this when we treat ourselves. We tend to. The vast majority of people I talk to turn the tap on with compassion for everybody around them. Super patient, super kind, super understanding. But when it comes to motivating and correcting themselves, the whip comes out. Now, what's that about? It works. I'm sure you get your piece of work done and you correct your mistakes and you get it in on time and all of that. But wow, you drag yourself through the coals to do it. And it's really, I can only speak for you. I'm guessing that actually it's quite corrosive and quite depleting and not a very pleasant experience. So it's not about letting yourself off the hook. You can still aim really high. You can still aim to get your A star and become CEO or KC or whatever it is. But doing it with much more, nourishment and kindness.
So when do you, in your experience, when do you find that people come to you and say, well, in some way the inner critic has stopped being that helpful and useful check and has become a real problem, corrosive or adjective to you?
Yeah, I guess the tipping point for a lot of people is when it's stopping them doing things. It's getting in the way of life. They're holding themselves back from applying for a job, or they're not dating because they don't feel attractive enough, or they're not seeing their friends because they think they're, getting boring, or so there's a sort of, they're functioning in the world in a different way. Yes. Yeah. But a lot of people do also quite well of functioning in the world sort of with a brave face on it, and inside there's all sorts of turmoil.
So if it does get out of control in that way, and it's having a debilitating effect on one's life, obviously they can come and see you or one of your colleagues. What else could somebody do? Maybe if they don't have those means, or they just, for whatever reason, they don't feel able to seek that sort of help. What sort of self-help can they seek?
Well, one thing that leaps to mind is a lot of people these days turn to literature and podcasts and self-help books. And at the back of the book, I've got a chapter all about that, signposting to people in the direction of the guys I learnt from, and I would still rate very highly, who can talk about this in much more kind of detail. And through those books, there are practices and self-practices and podcasts and things, and it's just it's a bit of psychoeducation as well, because as I sort of try to convey through my storytelling in the book, is step one for, well, putting it very crudely, step one for a lot of people is, first of all, recognising they got a self-critic. It's a bit like, quite often it's a bit like that anecdote about the fish in the water. They don't realise they're in the water until the big fish points it out. But so people can quite often take a bit of work before they realise they are beating themselves up. They're just so used to feeling in this mire of unworthiness. Somebody calls a trance of unworthiness. So first of all, is kind of realising that you've got that, and the length and breadth and depth of it is quite powerful. Very rarely I meet somebody who, when they realise quite how much they're beating themselves up, that's enough for them. They go, whoa, I'm not doing that anymore. But usually it takes a lot more work than that. And the next bit is understanding your critic. And that's what my book was about, was just suggesting to people to be curious about why it's there in the first place. Because if we understand why we have the critic there, that tends to make it easier to begin the work of distancing ourselves from it and being more curious about it. Oh, no wonder I feel this about me, because I had a big brother who spent years and years telling me that I was stupid and ugly, or I was savagely bullied at school, or I was part of a religious cult. Or so once we understand why we've internalized these messages, then it's much easier to have compassion for it and not let it drive, to use the metaphor, not let it grab the steering wheel anymore.
you're talking, the way you're talking about the inner critic is almost as if it's another person rather than an integral part of oneself.
Well, I didn't mean to suggest that, because I think it's really important to realise it is actually a part of ourselves. It's not a sort of, some people might get a bit, sometimes I talk to people a bit freaked out, that it can be so powerful, it feels to be kind of another part, and that in itself can set up a sort of fear. But it is a part of us that was, a bit of software that was developed with good reason. And we all have parts of selves, don't we? We all shift states. Well, speaking for myself, I know that I can feel my feels quite deeply and feel very differently from the morning to the evening, and that it tends to be usual. So it is a part of us, and we need to, because it's part of our story. We can't eradicate the bullying that we had, or the trauma that we had. So kind of respecting it, because the self-critic, also, I dig this into the book, the self-critic is actually a piece of defence, and at some point it would have served us quite well, more usually kind of in our childhood or when we were younger, but it's a case of getting to adulthood and giving it the P45. We don't need it anymore.
So it's something that we will have to live with, and it comes back to what you were saying right at the start of our discussion about your own inner critic. I think it was my words about putting her in a box. So if we have to continue living with our inner critic, and so is it a question of understanding it and developing almost like a relationship with it, not silencing it necessarily?
Yeah, I think that's right, because what we know, in the parlance of psychology, what we resist persists. So rather than silencing it or fighting it or telling it to shut up and criticising it, actually, as I say, the more fruitful way to live with it, and what will silence it, and you'll get more and more, the metaphor I use is just getting more and more space between you and it. So you're aware of it, but it's not grabbing the steering wheel. It's in the back of the car, looking out the window, minding its own business. But that comes through a process of, and it can sometimes take a very long time, of understanding where it comes from and not buying into its messages anymore. It doesn't mean that, as we said before, that you don't end up not criticising yourself, but you exercise a kind of wisdom and a discernment through, which is different from kind of responding to somebody, shouting at you internally.
No, it's not. Yeah, it's not all doom and gloom. Obviously, the shouting, if it is Brian Blessed with a megaphone in your ear 24 hours a day, that's going to be pretty debilitating.
Exactly.
So what you're saying is understanding it to the point that it perhaps returns to where it should be, which is the helpful self-check.
Yeah, and once you understand that the messages that is telling you come from somewhere else, that's really helpful too. Well, no wonder I think I'm an idiot if, as I said, my big brother called me an idiot for 15 years or whatever. You can exercise some wisdom around that and sort of check that and think about it rather than swallowing it whole.
Yeah. Well,
no, I was just going to say, as the last point, I know we should finish, but it is a bit of a kind of hackneyed intervention, but it's one that I use all the time. But if in doubt, just have a think about, would I say this to somebody? It's not even somebody I love particularly, somebody you like. Would you say to somebody out loud what you say to yourself, or think about that to yourself? Think about that about someone else that you might yourself. And quite often the answer is no. I would dream of saying that. Well, there you go. There's a starting point.
Julia, thank you very much. It's been
not at all
incredibly interesting.
Lovely to talk.
Taking the time to talk to you this morning.
Not at all. Thank you for having me.
Enjoy
okay. Take care. Bye.
Bye.